And I'm one of the co-founders of Direct Action Europe. But today I'm actually here to really just interrogate and ask questions of three other extraordinary people, Nelufar Hedayat, Greenwald, and Anita Krajnc, all of whom have done incredible work on what I'm going to describe as the front lines. And I don't want to talk too much, but when I say front lines, what we mean, at least at DXC, is the site of abuse. And over the past 20 to 30 years, whether it's with body cameras on police, leaks that have come from the NSA, or exposés of poaching and dog meat, or mobilizing grassroots activists that go directly to slaughterhouses in ways that have never before happened in the animal rights movement. All three of these individuals are taking people to the site of abuse. And I think what we want to do today is just ask some questions about what that means, what is possible and impossible, how industries and governments are going to respond when we keep exposing this abuse and going straight to the front lines, and then take some questions for you. So my plan is we have an hour, and we're going to go 10 minutes late, so we're going to go all the way to 11:55. My plan is to go until about 11:45 and then save about 5 to 10 minutes for questions. Does that sound good? And we'll ask you to ask very, very brief questions at the end. So let me just start with Glenn, because I don't think there's anyone in the world, frankly, who's done more to expose abuse than you. And I think I speak for a lot of people in this room that you're a personal hero of mine for doing that, whether it's working with WikiLeaks, Edward Snowden, I mean, so many of these different issues, and then recently animal agriculture. So I'm just wondering, what do you see as the intersection between kind of the media and frontline activism as someone who's been an activist journalist for decades now?
So first of all, let me just begin by saying that I actually am really honored to be here because any of the work that I've been able to do in exposing animal cruelty and the evils of animal and industrial agriculture has been solely the byproduct of the heroic courage of activists like all of you. And without that, I wouldn't have been able to accomplish anything. So I feel really honored and really inspired to be here. I traveled a long way to be here just for this, and I'm really thrilled that I did. It's interesting because I have had readers over the past year or so say, oh, this seems kind of like a new topic for you, a very radical break. We know that you in your personal life have rescued dogs and worked on animals before, but your journalism has never really focused on these issues. And on the most superficial level, that's kind of true, right? I've written a lot about war and transparency and secrecy and surveillance and imperialism and militarism, but not really directly about animal rights until the last few years. I'm sort of a new, kind of a soldier in this cause. But the more I've thought about it, the more I realize that it actually doesn't just have a lot in common, but is almost identical to all of the other abuses that I've worked on over the last decade. And I mean, we can talk a lot about, the reasons why that's true, but I'll just give you one example and one principle, which is that in general, the more corrupt and the more morally warped actors are, the more secrecy they are obsessed with surrounding themselves by, and therefore the greatest weakness for them is transparency. And I was just reading, I think yesterday, this new bill that has been introduced in the Israeli parliament that has a really good chance of being enacted, that would make it a crime to film members of the Israeli Defense Forces, period, on the grounds that filming them is to incite hatred and contempt for them because of how contemptible they are, right? So just showing them necessarily means that you're inspiring contempt because they're contemptuous. And that to me is the essence of journalism in general and this specific cause in particular, which is that the people who do evil things rely upon nobody knowing what it is they're doing and seeing what it is they're doing, and therefore their Achilles heel, the key to undermining and subverting and then weakening and then destroying them, is shining a light, in many cases literally attached to your heads, but then figuratively in terms of the work that I am and a lot of other journalists are now able to do because of your heroism and courage, in order to show people the truth and reality of what they do, because I think nobody with an active conscience can tolerate it any longer, and that to me has been the strain throughout all the work that I've been doing.
Thanks, Glenn. And I'm going to ask Nelufar next. that, I think the media climate has changed tremendously over the past 20 years. And, I know, Glenn, you've complained about this a lot. You're known as a critic of the media. But you've had a lot of struggles too. And I know we've talked about your struggles to bring attention to this cause that otherwise hasn't received a lot of attention. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about the work you've done in exposing and shining sunlight on the dog meat trade and poaching and the difficulties, both logistical and personal, in terms of kind of the physical dangers of being there, but also just getting through the media kind of almost blackout of animal cruelty and how hard it is to get big media outlets and powerful corporations to talk about these issues.
I just want to echo a lot of what Glenn said, which is we really would never be able to do the work that we do if it wasn't for you guys doing the work that you do, because we, in a sense, we get the glory for your hard work. It's quite narcissistic what we do, but I think it's true. I mean, just to be real. But what I would say is my particular brand of journalism, which is what you asked me to talk about, is I'm a reporter. So I go and get primary sources. I go to the front lines in terms of the journalism, speak to the people, go and see the animals and understand and unpack the structures that keep us and the animals and every other story that I've worked on oppressed. So for me, it isn't a case of, Glenn does all the beautiful and hard work of thinking big picture and broadly. I go to the sort of epicenter of whatever the case is and look at people and places. So in a sense, my journalism is more about trying to understand how systems of oppression work on every intricate level, whether it is in one small cage in a dog meat factory in Vietnam, through to other work I've done in Africa and in Asia. So to that, I would say, for me, it's been really, really difficult to get these kind of stories out into the mainstream domain. So that's the kind of area that I work at. I'm preaching to the converted. Okay, you guys have made it over that threshold, so I don't need to tell you anything. You could teach me far more. But what I'm trying to do is to speak to the people who probably have never heard of the word veganism, probably don't understand the concept, think it's a diet, understand it more to be like a cookie thing that, the girl with the weird eyebrows does or whatever. It's so niche. Yes,
For the record, your eyebrows are not weird. They're wonderful.
That's because I spent a long time trying to get them sorted.
You did well. You did well, Nelufar. Am I right? Aren't the eyebrows good? Everything about Nelufar's good, but the eyebrows are great. Don't worry, they're not weird.
You guys. But that would be my point, that it's very, very hard to get somebody whose lives don't revolve around these things that we preoccupy ourselves with, who are struggling to live day to day themselves, let alone care about a chicken. Who cares about a chicken when I can barely feed my family? So my audience, the people that I'm trying to speak to, the people who I am in service of, are those that need to see these things to be able to make the decisions for themselves. I am not an activist, as much as I would like to think that I am. I'm not. I'm a journalist. My job is to bring facts We live in this really weird age right now, and Glenn can attest to this, that we live in an age of like post-truth. Like there's no truth. Everyone's truth is whatever they think is true. I don't know. I'm not quite familiar with it. But we don't yet live in a post-fact world. Not yet. Facts are facts. So my job and our job is to go and get those facts and present it to people, and they can make their own minds up.
It's really powerful work. And I want to bring this to Anita next, because I think Glenn and Nelufar obviously have incredible influence with the outlets they've worked with the history and record they have as journalists. But what you've tried to do is basically make citizens journalists. That we now have, it's well over 200 saved chapters around the world.
400.
400? 400. I'm sorry, I should have watched your slides. I'm remembering the slide now. It's jumped so much in the past year. 400 saved chapters where you're encouraging people to go to slaughterhouses and document everything they see, to bear witness. So can you tell me how you feel your work intersects with folks like Glenn and Nelufar, and how citizens like the citizens in this room can connect their work up with people who have a little bit more of a broader voice like Glenn or Nelufar?
So I think of slaughterhouses like war zones, and it's a very transformative experience to go to a war zone, and journalists experience that. And so we want everyone to go to slaughterhouses and bear witness, and so we say everyone has a duty to bear witness. The question is, how are we going to make it happen? That's the big question. So from our perspective, we combine the strategy of bearing witness with love-based community organizing. And community organizing means that, you organize, so you have a duty to find a slaughterhouse in your area and organize vigils. But you also have a duty to build the movement and develop leadership in others. We live in an age where, there are 56 billion land animals going to slaughter, trillions of fish, and we only have 400 save groups, yet there are millions of slaughterhouses. So we have just begun. We want millions of vigils at every site of abuse. And a lot of people say that when they've gone to a vigil and looked in the eyes of a turkey, a chicken, a duck, a pig, a cow, and going to slaughter, it's like you see a soul and you see a beautiful being going to hell, going to a death camp. And you want to do everything you can to save it and save them. And Tolstoy said, bearing witness is coming as close as you can and trying to help. So we only partially bear witness because the animals go to slaughter. But we're trying to build a mass movement with people power to be able to actually fully save the animals. So I believe we need a permanent organizing institute to train community organizers and to build a mass movement.
Absolutely, and I remember the first time you told me this vision of having huge encampments near your slaughterhouse, like Occupy Wall Street, occupy the slaughterhouse, right? And then I was so struck by that vision. I think one of the reasons people came here is because all of you have really interesting personal biographies too, and Glenn and I actually probably have the most similar personal biography, but I think it's fascinating how people are coming to the animal rights movement from so many different backgrounds. And I was a corporate lawyer too. I was a securities litigator in Chicago, and now I'm an animal rights activist who's on the most wanted list with the FBI. But I think a lot of people don't know your history. Most people see Glenn as, certainly on a terrorism watch list, has gotten in so much trouble with the U.S. government. Honestly, I'm sure there are 10 infiltrators in the room now just because Glenn's here. And Glenn has become one of the biggest proponents of civil disobedience and rule breaking, frankly, in the history of the American Republic. But I wonder if you could share a little about your personal joy towards activism and towards compassion towards animals. I mean, what were the things that drove you?
Well, first of all, I'm sure that any informants who are here for me have a lot of multitasking to do at this conference and are probably diverting their eyes to a lot of other places. So I hope they're not getting dizzy or whatever. But, it's interesting because I've actually thought about this a lot because I was somebody who loved animals from the time that I first had consciousness. Neighbors of mine had dogs and cats and even, just gerbils and rabbits and any kind of animal I just instinctively felt a great emotional connection to. And yet, as I said earlier, it wasn't until the last few years when I really became a devotee to the broader cause of animal liberation and animal rights, and even stopped eating meat and so I spent my whole life, my whole adult life, kind of with this extraordinary disconnect between this profound love for animals that I felt early on and always nurtured on the one hand, and then on the other hand, unconsciously supporting this industry that tortures and slaughters them en masse. And, so I spent a long time trying to understand what got me to engage in behavior that was so contrary to not just my principles and moral philosophies, but my instinctive moral values as a human being. Not just because I find my own journey so fascinating, but more importantly, because I want other people who are similarly conflicted, I want to understand how to enter their thought process and kind of change that behavior as well. And, it's one of the things that we were just talking about, which is I just simply never internalized the fact that the piece of meat that I was eating on my plate used to be an animal, and that the bacon that I was eating used to be a highly emotionally complex pig, and the torture and the pain and the suffering that went into putting this on my plate. And it's kind of like what Anita was saying before. I think the war zone mentality is so perfect because we're a country that has been at war for 18 consecutive years now and for many decades before that, and we've killed huge numbers of innocent people and continue to all over the world, including children and women and innocent men. And the question becomes, well, how as a population can we continue to just acquiesce to that? And the reason, of course, is because it all stays hidden, right? So you hear kind of like very sketchy news reports where 12 people are killed on a routine basis, but they're instantly labeled militants or radicals or terrorists or collateral damage. And so it enables you to just kind of separate yourself from it and to ignore the fact that it's happening. And so, actually, as somebody, my husband and I have spent the last decade rescuing hundreds and hundreds of dogs, and we've now created a shelter, and yet all this time, for the first part, while I'm devoting myself to saving dogs and to, being internally tormented by animal suffering, I'm still eating meat. And so, understanding why I was allowed to do that, how I enabled myself to do that, is something that, as now somebody who's a journalist who's begun to spend time trying to reach people who aren't the people in this room, but the people who similarly have that instinctive empathy and love for animals, but haven't yet understood the consequences of their action, how to similarly convert them into that process. And I'll just share with you one anecdote about that, because I don't think I've figured it out yet, and I know that I'm at the very, very beginning of my work on animal liberation, which is exciting for me. And part of why I wanted to come
I think
here
it's even
is
more
to
exciting for us, Glenn.
absorb, I want to absorb your wisdom and insights that you've developed from having worked on it for a lot longer than I have. But we were picked up at the airport last night. My husband David and I came together, and we were being driven here by somebody from DXE, and I was sharing with him this insight that I recently had, because my husband and I, we adopted two children last year, and they spent their whole lives, or most of their lives, in a shelter in the northeastern part of Brazil, this very impoverished region, and they kind of came out sort of malnourished and very, just like dependent upon a very strict diet that is centered around meat. And so obviously, your first concern is their health, and you don't want to, the change of adoption is so radical anyway, but I want them to just start thinking about this process. And every time, there's a piece of meat in front of them, I always say to them before we begin eating, I just want you to know, by the way, that used to be a cow. And they react with kind of this horror. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to hear about that. And David was in the back seat. I've usually done it when he wasn't there. That was the first time he heard about it, so we had a little digressive debate about whether or not that's good parenting, which we agreed to table for later. But what it really kind of showed me is that inside of all of us is this kind of this part of our conscience that knows that it's wrong. And just like we know that it's wrong to engage in militarism and dominate the world through constant killing and so many other policies that we allow ourselves to support. And so the more we're reminded of it on a visceral level, the more difficult it becomes to engage in the behavior, just like my kids enjoy that meal less once they have to think about what it is that happened. And that's why I think you're so right. Well, both of you are so right in what you said, that the more of a light that is shined on the reality of what goes into this, the more people will start changing their behavior. And that is my journey. That's just essentially, I began reading the work and seeing the films of DXE activists and other people, and could no longer deny to myself the reality of what I was supporting.
Yeah, I'll definitely have some more questions for you, Glenn, about transparency. But Nelufar, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about your personal journey, and you've shared a little bit with me about it, and seeing kind of the dog meat farms in Vietnam and being shaken by that. But I'll let you take it.
So I'm Afghan. So I have a very interesting relationship with America, at large. A lot of those 18 years of constant war Americans has been in my homeland. So I have like a really, I was a refugee as a kid, and then I moved to England and London, which is where I grew up. And I was always fascinated with journalism, because I thought, how are these people allowed to get away with telling the truth and speaking their mind, and no one stops them, no one kills them, no one harasses them, no one coerces them, which is what happened to a lot of my mum and dad's friends when they were growing up. So when I was 15, I was like, I'm going to be a journalist. That was it. That was all I ever wanted to do. So I was fortunate and lucky enough to become one. And the main thing that I focused on was conflict. Where there is conflict, where there was war, I went to a lot of the Arab Spring nations and Afghanistan and other places to kind of document and witness war and the effects that has on people. And then someone said to me, oh, you've got an assignment. I was like, what's the assignment? You're going to make a film about dog meat. I was like, oh, silliness. What is this silliness? So I thought it was trite. I thought it was silly. I thought it was niche. Who eats dog meat? Who does that? No. Cow meat is sensible. They should all eat cow meat. That's the sensible thing to do, was what I thought. I went off and made this film about dog meat. And I spent 3 weeks traversing up and down Vietnam. And I saw, between sort of 20 and 30, start to finish. So dogs alive, killed, skinned, gutted, put out for sale. So, repeatedly. And it didn't bother me because I'd seen worse that's been perpetrated against humans and people. Then I came back to England, and we have to do this thing called a right to reply. Okay, which means that you give the opposition, the people you are making these accusations at, the right to come back at you with why and justifications of why they did this. So I'm sat there and I was like, okay, so we're saying that the Vietnamese government are barbaric. We're saying they're brutal. We're saying that they butcher these animals and it's unhygienic and it's not humane. I love that word. So we were making all of these accusations. And my director at the time, Daniel Bogado, said, we need something to compare it to. Go and find out what is the highest standard of animal welfare within the animal agriculture business, and then we can say they're brutal in comparison to. So I spent about 8 days, and by the end of it, I got so obsessed. It was about 18 hours a day. I couldn't stop myself. I got very obsessed with it, trying to figure out what humane things we were doing in the European Union, which is where I live, in Europe. And then I read about baby piglets being smashed against the wall, and I read about the number of misbolting that was being self-reported by the industry, and I read about the things that go into the meat that we eat, and I felt like I had crossed some kind of Rubicon, like I'd taken a pill from the Matrix, and there was no going back. How could I stand there in a voiceover booth and accuse the Vietnamese of being brutal and having all these Orientalist opinions when I was condoning it myself where I was from? And it was just the most, it's weird when you have to face your own hypocrisy so blatantly. And I think, I can't speak for any of you guys, but for me, it was like, I'm a hypocrite. I'm slightly racist, but mainly a hypocrite. How can I possibly say that they're brutal and that they don't know better? And when we have institutionalized to a fine degree the abuse and torment of animals. And I couldn't go back from that knowledge. So that was my moment of sort of waking up and seeing what was happening.
Thank you. And Anita, it's a very powerful story of how you came to see bearing witness as an obligation. And I know you've lost Bean, and I'm sorry, but if you want to share a little bit about that.
In 2006, I moved back to Toronto. I'd been teaching a course on strategies and tactics and social movements, and I was already a vegan and an activist, and I moved within a kilometer of a slaughterhouse. And I thought, oh, well, somebody should do something about it. And 4 years went by, and I never bothered to go to the slaughterhouse or look for the animals going to slaughter. But then I adopted Mr. Bean, a Beagle Whippet mix, and I would walk with Mr. Bean along Lakeshore every morning and see transport trucks in rush hour traffic, so you could actually see the pigs looking out. And at the time, I was reading Tolstoy, Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and who talked about taking action when there's an injustice in your community. And so a bunch of us, including some people here, we held organizing meetings and started Toronto Pig Safe. And because I had taught that course in social movements, we applied a lot of the community organizing principles, like staging frequent direct actions, being on the ground regularly. So the first time I bore witness close to a pig, I looked them in the eye and I promised them a minimum of 3 vigils a week, every week, including Christmas, no matter what. And so we've done over 1,000 vigils in the Toronto area. And the idea was to not only build a local movement, but have one that could expand. So within 2.5 years, that Toronto slaughterhouse went bankrupt. They were killing 6,000 pigs a day. They were the second biggest slaughterhouse in Ontario. So then we moved to another location, Fearman's Pig Slaughterhouse. And the movement slowly grew. And another principle that we applied was Marshall Gantz's work. He's a professor of sociology at Harvard. And he wrote a book, Why David Sometimes Wins. And he tried to understand why the United Farm Workers were successful in organizing a union, whereas other attempts by the AFL-CIO failed in the 1930s, the 1950s, the 1960s. And it was because the United Farm Workers had expanding leadership teams. So it's not about me, it's about a team, and an expanding team and being open to that. So in the case of United Farm Workers, they had SNCC, civil rights workers, who came in and joined and brought their experience in repertoires and applied, community organizing tactics and things like that. So I am a firm believer that a good strategy and tactic involves as many people as possible. And I want everyone to be like bearing witness and also accepting that they have that duty, but also duty to organize.
Thank you. And now that we're talking about movements, you mentioned the Arab Spring, and I know Glenn has covered a lot of different social movements. I think we're living in an age of social movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, obviously the Arab Spring. And we see so many people mobilizing for so many causes, so much anxiety about the world, especially under the Trump administration. We're also seeing so much abuse and so much power held by corporations and the government to surveil us, to hold things secret that should not be secret, and use modern technology in ways that we couldn't even imagine 10 years ago, drones, for example. So I'm wondering, in the battle between movements and the institutions in power, what do you think is the most important thing for grassroots activists to know that they should do or shouldn't do, for that matter, to make sure that we leverage as much of our people power against corporate power and government power? I know that's a big and hard question, but if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mean, in some sense, that's the central strategic question that I think needs to be grappled with before all others, because that's ultimately the question about efficacy, but also protection of the movement. And one of the things I realized that's this really exciting and in some ways hilarious irony is that the more technology and technological weapons that centers of power produce for themselves to entrench their own power, the more weapons they're actually simultaneously giving to those who want to undermine and subvert them. And one of the best examples is that one of my childhood heroes, who I've been honored to be able to work with and become friends with, is Daniel Ellsberg, who actually lives in the Bay Area. And one of the things that the first conversation that I ever had with him, he told me this hilarious story about how when he wanted to leak the Pentagon Papers, his biggest challenge was just how do you copy 50,000 top secret pages without detection? Like literally, do you go to the drugstore with a huge bag of nickels and just like one after the next in front of your neighborhood pharmacist, just like photostat them? And it took him months to figure out a secure way to do that. Whereas when Chelsea Manning decided that she had seen massive amounts of evidence of war crimes, she was able to download hundreds of thousands or more of the government's most sensitive documents literally while she listened to a Lady Gaga song on her computer screen so that nobody could see it, and was done and had sent it off to WikiLeaks before the song was finished.
Is that a true story?
That is a true story, and it was like actually Lady Gaga.
It wasn't actually Lady Gaga. But it was a YouTube
Chelsea
video.
makes all the sense in the world. And so as centers of power start to consolidate the kind of evidence of their dirty deeds digitally, because that empowers them, it also empowers people who want to expose them, because it becomes much easier to take their weapons and use it against them. And I think that the animal rights and animal liberation movement has done that as well as, if not better than anyone. I mean, the fact that, you take cameras, which 15 years ago were the sole province of sophisticated corporate-owned news outlets, and turn those weapons against these corporations in order to expose what it is that they do, and then use the power of the internet in order to force people to see what they don't want to see, I think is really the ultimate answer to that question, which is figure out how to take the weapons that are designed to repress and to figure out instead how to use them as a tool to liberate. The same is true with things like encryption, which I hope everybody in this room has spent some amount of time thinking about. Encryption originally was intended for people who are in the CIA or militaries that suppress people, to prevent their communications from being detected by the people they want to drop bombs on. And encryption now is instead available for all of you in this room who want to organize in a way that the FBI would like to listen to prevent them from doing so. And so constantly figuring out this dual usage, I think is the most important thing. And I think the second thing is everything that we've been talking about, which is, as I was saying earlier, this whole kind of division that we allow ourselves to succumb to, of on the one hand being moved by these horrors, but on the other hand allowing ourselves to continue to support them simply by turning away. It's true of war, and it's definitely true of, of the abuses of animals. Wayne is a really great guy. As a journalist, I can say he's a great source to talk to. But at the same time, even to this day, I dread when I have to pick up the phone and call Wayne and hear about whatever your latest action was, because I know along the way he's going to start to tell me the things that he saw when he got to the slaughterhouse or got to the industrial factory. And so I always have to steel myself, okay, I'm going to schedule this Wayne call, even though I'm procrastinating it, because even now instinctively I want to turn away from it. And because all of you in this room have prevented me from turning away and kind of forced me to confront it, that's what led to my transformation. And I think figuring out how to use this technology to continue to force people to confront the evils that in their gut and in their conscience they really want to stop, I think that's the key to everything that we're spending this conference talking about.
Thank you. It's extremely insightful. Nelufar, I know we've had some conversations about kind of the opportunities and threats for activists in the media climate that we're in today. And just, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or advice on that same question. What do grassroots activists need to know in the age of social movements in order to get these large, powerful corporations who still have much broader distribution than what we have on Facebook to pay attention to these issues?
I'm going to plagiarize a lot of what you said yesterday, because I'm a lazy journalist. Yesterday, you and I were in conversation on the stage, and we were talking about how to... it was a law thing, I don't understand, something about litigation and animal activism. I pretended to understand really effectively, but that was just that. One of the things that Wayne said that spoke to me, and again, I came to this conference to learn more than anything else. You spoke about presenting things as an opportunity. So when I went to my channel, Fusion, and I was like, hey, can I have $3 million to do this thing? I had to present it as the best opportunity they have of all the people pitching stuff to them, which is constant. It's a barrage of things. Oh, let's make something about, I don't know, a recent trend or ISIS, or because that's who we're all competing with. We're competing with column inches, and we're competing with linear television hours and slots to get our stuff out there. It's very difficult, really difficult. So how do I manage to make it palatable, appealing for a cable channel, a commercial, for-profit channel, to make this stuff? The easiest way for me to do that is to show them that we are, in essence, ahead of the curve. This is the greatest opportunity to speak to young people and the younger generation who, and Zoe's in here somewhere, I don't know where she is, but she is my guiding star. This girl, oh my goodness. She is just she's half my age, and she's so enlightened and brilliant. I was just in awe of her yesterday at the march. But the point is that these young folk are basically who I'm supposed to be targeting. So if I can say there's a growing number, here's the stats, here's the figures, here's the facts, the growing number of young people are interested in this, let's get ahead of that curve, let's make it sexy, let's get Nicole Richie on this thing, let's get Moby on this thing, slap a few celebrities on it, package it up nice and shiny and pretty, and this is what I always say to people, my job is to entertain and then inform. So if I can get a little bit of truth or a little bit of fact or information in through the kind of eyeliner and thing of it all, I've done my job. That's all I'm trying to do. Because remember, again, it's really important that you guys realize you are all part of you have been enlightened. You've passed that stage. There are people out there that don't even, they're not, I mean, to speak on what you were saying, Glenn, they're not against us. They understand what activism and animal rights is. They're just meh, more other things to worry about. So my job is to be bamboozle them with fun and exciting things, but also then be hey, listen, factory farms aren't cool. Look at this. Here's some, what we did, which I'll show you guys later at my keynote speech.
Please come to that. It's going to be very exciting. World exclusive.
Yeah. I shouldn't do it, but I'm gonna. I came to you. I flew all the way over here from China, which is where I was at the slaughterhouses, Smithfield Slaughterhouse. It's actually the WH group out there, but to you to see you do this stuff, and I can bring that to my audience. And bringing you in contact with the audience, we are that conduit, we are the proxy, we are the thing that connects the mainstream, the masses to sort of people like you. So if we can package it correctly and make it look sassy and interesting, we're more likely to get commissions. And channels are savvying up, they're understanding that there is space for these voices, and they will give it to us.
So I think Nelufar just let out that there's going to be a world premiere of something at 4 p.m. today. So you got to come here to see it. So come to Nelufar Stock. But Anita, I mean, you have personally faced off with a large, powerful institution and won in the Compassion is Not a Crime case. So I'm wondering if there's one thing you hope grassroots activists take away in this age of movements, where we do have these movements growing, but then these powerful forces trying to dismantle us. What do you hope activists take away from this conference, from your journey against a pig farm?
Okay. Well, I think the number one thing is the idea that we're all organizers, and that comes from the community organizing philosophy. And so, last year I spoke about the duty to bear witness, and the importance of not looking away. I mean, if the whole world consisted of people that did not look away when someone was suffering and came close and tried to help, we wouldn't have genocides, we wouldn't have various social injustices, we wouldn't have this animal emergency. But how do we get there? And the only way we get there practically is we have to organize. So that's sort of the new emphasis that I'd like to put out there. And Amira and I were just talking now about the importance of having a permanent organizing institute. Other social movements have had that. Eric Mann, who organized the Bus Riders Union in LA, set up a strategic organizing institute. Saul Alinsky, just before he died in 1972, set up an organizing institute. Other social movements have done this. It's time that the animal rights movement set up a permanent organizing institute. And one of the purposes would be to have organizing drives. So in the labor movement, Kate Brofenbrenner wrote a book called Organizing to Win. And what they talked about in that book is that the Service Employees International Union, which represents janitors, security guards, nurses, spend 25% of their resources on organizing drives. And they are the fastest and biggest union in the US. So we have to invest in organizing drives. And so the SAFE movement has had people go country to country, town to town, set up SAFEs, AVs, DXEs. And my parents came from the former Yugoslavia, Slovenia. There was no street activism there. When Ruth and Siobhan went there, suddenly there's street activism. So yeah, I'm a firm believer in the duty to organize.
I want to ask just a few specific questions to each individual now, too. And I mean, the biggest one I have for you, Glenn, is that, in the battle for transparency, you've talked a lot about how important transparency is to creating change. We're living in a surveillance state. We're living in a state where there's so much secrecy, and technology, and frankly, just political movements have in some ways reinforced secrecy and surveillance rather than transparency. If you look at the Trump administration as an example, although I know, there's some debates about that you've had about how the media's portrayed some of those disputes. But in that battle between these people who don't have power, trying to create transparency, and powerful institutions that don't have transparency, who's winning right now? Do you have an optimistic vision, or are you pessimistic about the future?
Well, so, I'll just share with you an anecdote that kind of shaped my outlook on, I guess, life in general, but definitely political activism in particular, and it's the work for which, my journalism is best known, which was the work that I did on the reporting about the NSA, which was work that I was able to do because one really kind of just very ordinary person inside the NSA decided that what it was that he was seeing was so unjust and menacing and horrifying that he just couldn't, in good conscience, allow himself any longer to live with the knowledge that he had the power to do something about it, and yet failed to do so. And so, Edward Snowden decided that he was willing to go to prison for the next 5 decades or be killed in order to bring to light what it was that was being done to one of the most important innovations in human history, which was the internet, the power to liberate and to organize and to circumvent corporate institutions, to communicate information to one another, and that instead it was being converted in total secrecy into the greatest tool of oppression and control and coercion. And so the reason why that was just so kind of perspective altering and life altering to me was because I had, as somebody who had spent the last decade been writing about really kind of gloomy, depressing things, right? Like things that these incredibly powerful factions are doing in a way that seemingly you can't remotely stand up to, like spending, the last 17 years bombing Afghanistan and Iraq and Yemen and Somalia and Pakistan and Libya and lots of other places around the world, or police abuse of the kind that just seems impossible to stand up to, lest you kind of get rolled over along with it. What this taught me was that just any individual, no matter how ordinary, through an act of conscience and conviction, really can change the world. Just through a sheer act of commitment and principle. And I think it's so critical because I know that one of the things that powerful factions try and do is constantly flamboyantly display their power, kind of like peacocks, right? Like walking around showing off their pretty feathers, because they want you to feel their power, in this really kind of internalized and visceral way so that you fear confronting them, but more so that you come to really believe that your activism is for naught. Right? That like you can wake up and you can go to a march and you can be around like-minded people and feel good about yourself for a day and feel happy that you marched, but like deep inside you don't really believe that you're actually going to win because the forces are too formidable, the institutions are too powerful and well-armed. This is learned helplessness. This is something really important to centers of power to internalize. And if you look at history, like you just see how radically and quickly public opinion can shift, and change. I am working now on a film that we just announced last week of the life of Martina Navratilova and the effect that she's had on people. And I've been thinking a lot about it because I've been reading all this. You go and you look at how people talked about women and gay people and immigrants just as recently as the 1980s and the 1990s. What was mainstream to say about her and people like her would today get you fired. So within a really short period of time, the mores have changed so radically, and it's true in so many different places. And so you can look at so many individual examples like Edward Snowden, and because the reality is that usually change comes not from these great people with all this power and position and prestige, but it comes from ordinary people, like a Tunisian street vendor who decides to set himself on fire and then galvanizes a revolutionary movement in a region against the world's most entrenched dictators that are from ordinary people. And so as long as you cling to that truth, which is a truth, and don't let anybody get you to repudiate it or doubt it, which is that the power that you have inside of yourself is very real to bring about the most radical and revolutionary changes, nothing can stop you. And there's a lot that will try and convince you to do that, and there's so many people who will inspire you to realize it's not true. And honestly, if I had to say, what is the main reason you got on a plane and flew 22 hours or however long you flew, I don't know how long you flew, but it seemed forever. That was my reason for doing it, was to be around all the people in this room who do truly inspire me, and to cling to that knowledge, not that opinion, not that belief, not that pipe dream, but the knowledge that the injustices that you're working against not only can be destroyed and defeated, but can be destroyed and defeated within your lifetime and way faster than you think.
Wow. Those are words to live a life by, huh, folks? So sorry you have to go after that, Nelufar. That was quite an oratory. But one of the things that I think has been most powerful about your work is the use of storytelling. You were telling us about how you use personalities and people to illustrate these powerful stories. And that's one of the things that's been a theme of this conference and of DXC's work too. So I'm wondering if you can tell me and tell us about how you use storytelling to effectively leverage, the people who are marginalized and their stories to challenge people in power and institutions in power.
One of the things that I tried to do is not labor under the false pretense that we can get people to care about things in the same way that we do. So the things that I care about passionately, if I wrote them all down, you probably might think that some of them are aligned with what you care about passionately, that you would lay your life down for, or that you would spend jail time on. It's hopefully not, but, you know. But that you would risk that. It's unlikely. So what I try to do is to make my audiences, or to make people who watch my films, put themselves in the shoes of the other. Because I am the other. I'm a woman, I'm brown, I'm a refugee, I was trafficked into England. All of these things define who I am, and they inform a lot of the things that I'm fascinated by. So when I'm out and I'm trying to get someone to care about something, I try to personalize it as much as possible. So when I'm out in Uganda and I'm meeting Winnie, who's a farmer, and she's living in one room about the size of two of these little things here, platforms here, working her little butt off to try and feed her kids and go to school. But at the same time, I'm having a discussion with her about animal agriculture to try and understand what GMOs are doing to affect her life. The point is that my audience sees Winnie, and from now on, when they think about these things, they see Winnie. And it's easier to care about Winnie than it is to understand how GMOs work and what, all of these technologies are. So specifically to the stuff that I've been doing around food and the industrial agricultural complex, the easiest thing for me to do is to get my audience to engage, is to show them the stories firsthand. So we went out with the Sea Shepherds. We went out, I'm terribly seasick. You don't understand how seasick I am. Just the idea of it makes me want to vomit. But I went out with them for 5 days to show legal trawling. And I think one of the things that we haven't touched upon that I think is really important is, just because something is legal doesn't make it morally right. That's so important to what I believe and the journalism that I do. Loads of things were legal that were morally reprehensible, that we now look at and shudder and cringe. And I think this is one of those things, the way we treat animals. That's just one of those things. So by presenting this, by humanizing the story, by making it as easy to put your feet in that person's shoes, I think that's how I get people to engage and understand and remember Winnie's story.
So Glenn's talked about the power of individuals and individual acts of conscience to challenge power. You've talked about the power of stories. And one of the really cool things about SAVE that has inspired me and has actually led to changes in DXC is the power of love. Because we deal with so much violence and anger triggered from our experience of that violence in the secondary trauma we deal with. The idea that our movement should be 100% just based on love. I'm not a very touchy-feely person. People who know me know that, until I was 25 years old, I wouldn't let anyone physically touch me. I had a stick that I carried around. I said, if you want to give me a hug, just poke me from a safe distance. So love is something that's a little terrifying to me. I mean, my parents never said they loved me. They did love me, but they didn't. So when I first heard this, honestly, I was like, that sounds creepy and I don't like it. But you've completely convinced me that, especially in the face of all these challenges, the repression, the abuse, we have to think about love. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about what you mean by love-based organizing and the power of love to transform the world.
Okay, yeah. The philosophy that we've based our movement on is Leo Tolstoy's work, and he wrote a book called The Kingdom of God is Within You. And Gandhi read this book in 1893 when he was in South Africa, and it confirmed his conviction that nonviolence was the path to go. And in it, he says things like, he likes to quote from the Bible, but he was considered an anarchist Christian, but he wasn't really a Christian. He believed in the good in all religions, and he was somebody that drew all those religions together, so I just wanted to put that caveat out there. He liked to quote Jesus saying, I came here to save you, not to judge you. And I really like the name of the SAVE movement, the Animal Save movement, because we're here to save animals, save people in terms of their health, save the environment, and save people's conscience. And I just like the word save. It's very, positive. And so love is the most powerful force in the universe, along with truth. Those are the two, powerful forces. And so in this non-judgmental approach, when we go to slaughterhouses, we don't we don't judge meat eaters. We try to transform them and convert them. That's our mission.
Thank you. Okay, we have 10 minutes left, and so we're going to give a few people opportunities for questions. I'm probably just going to walk around and bring the mic to you, if that's okay with everyone. I'm going to play MC. And do we have a line here? Is that what this line is? No. Why don't we form a line here after Aiden, and try to keep your questions brief, and if you're going too long, I'll probably cut you off, because we only have 10 minutes. But go ahead, Aiden.
All right, this one's for Glenn and Nelufar. So Sean King started writing for The Intercept, I guess a year and a half ago, maybe. And after that, I mean, he's made a series of increasingly progressive statements about kind of how his view on animal rights has changed. So my question is, how have you seen other folks in the oppositional journalism community kind of respond to you bringing this issue up more? And do you think there's anything we can do to make that appeal more clearly to those folks? I'm thinking of someone especially like James Rison, who, people have really spent their lives doing the same kind of, like looking at the same kind of systems you're looking at. How can we help folks make that connection with government oppression more?
So it's funny because people at The Intercept joke that I've completely ruined their lunch hour because they feel guilty each time they eat. Every article that I publish there makes just the lunch hour a bit gloomier, which I'm happy to hear about. But Sean is a really great example, and I actually think it's a great illustration of what Anita was just talking about, which is, it's so easy, and I've been guilty of this myself before, to adopt political principles in the abstract that you kind of praise yourself for and that are really quite just and virtuous, but that you don't quite get yourself to translate into who you are as a human being. Maybe because, as Wayne talked about, we're trained to just be afraid of emotion or whatever. And to me, political activism really doesn't have any vibrancy or soul or life to it, and still it starts translating into who you are as a human being and the way that you live your life. And I found Sean King to be a really amazing example, because he's not somebody who's been an animal person his whole life, but he's somebody who, in his activism against racist police abuse, felt like he was doing that out of empathy and compassion and love. And he is, and he was, and he does. And so when I started writing about the torture and systematic abuse of animals, it resonated with his capacity for empathy, with his love for other living beings. And I used to think that dogs were the kind of gateway into animal rights activism. Like, I would put pictures of dogs up, kind of as the drug dealer outside the playground saying, "Come here, pet the dog." And now here's this whole veganism for you. I actually have changed my mind about that. I do think that it is appealing to people's better side, to that instinct that I talked about seeing in my own children, to the kind of emotions that Anita just described and that I think transformed Sean. I think it's exactly right that it's so important not to preach at people or condemn them or denounce them, but to appeal to that part of their humanness that will, if you show it to them the right way, realize that it's wrong and kind of compel them to change.
I just want to say, hold your cameras this way, okay, not that way when you're recording stuff. That's my main thing to you guys, please, for goodness sake. Sorry, I'm going to be very practical and just say 3 things. Seriously, it is very hard when we're trying to put this, at the march or at a vigil, or when you're going out doing these stuff. Hold your camera sideways so we can put it on the telly box this way. Make sure that you speak clearly and coherently. Think through your arguments. Don't get angry. Don't play to the stereotype.
So I view animal rights as an apolitical issue, whether you're on the left or the right. Everybody loves animals. Nobody wants to see cats or dogs or even chickens get hurt. And I guess my question is, how do you think that we're going to get people in the center and on the right to feel welcome in this community and to come fight with us?
I mean, I think that it's such an important question, and so does he, and obviously we're both equally excited. And one of the things that I've noticed since I began really centering this issue as part of my journalism is that there is trans ideological and trans partisan appeal. One of the things that excited me the most about the NSA story, similarly, was that it kind of united people on the left who have a fear of security state agencies and people on the right who feared government control and coercion and letting it become too powerful. And that was one of the things that excited me about it, was that it didn't divide along these banal ideological lines and therefore just lead to this paralysis. And I do think that the capacity to love animals is not in any way a byproduct of ideology or partisan affiliation. And I think you see that, actually. There's a lot of bills pending in Congress, for example, to ban animal experimentation on a taxpayer-funded basis that come from pretty far-right Republican members of Congress. And of course, one of the worst pieces of legislation that made animal rights activists like you terrorists was sponsored by your fantastic senior senator who belongs to the Democratic Party here in California, Dianne Feinstein. So I think that the stuff that we're talking about, that we've all been talking about this whole time, doesn't have any kind of partisan or ideological component to it. It used to be that animal rights was perceived, kind of like you were saying, as this kind of like fringe left-wing position of strange people who have weird diets. And I think the more our relationship to animals has changed, the more potential there is to kind of recruit people to this cause across the spectrum.
Yeah, and just to jump on the back of what Glenn's saying, I think what's really interesting to me in terms of getting politics to come on board as well, is when you start talking about animal welfare, you can't not talk about human welfare. And oftentimes, specifically with animal agriculture, people are oppressed in the process of animal oppression and animal abuse. It's absolute. I've documented it. I spent a year last year documenting it. So what I've noticed is a holistic approach to this problem that we have, which is we don't really like how animals are being treated in our food systems, and understanding. And I spend a lot of my documentary hours focusing on the people that are being as affected and used and subjugated as the animals. I think that's really important in changing perceptions and understanding that this isn't just a problem for a cat or a sheep or a pig, but this is a problem for your neighbor, the guy who has to work in the slaughterhouse, the woman who has to smell the shit in the lagoons next to the slaughterhouse. That's kind of been a really important part of, I think, the change that we're seeing too.
So I think we're going to do one last question. Sorry, everyone, but maybe we can deliver questions by email to them later.
Thank you, Wayne. And again, congratulations for all your amazing work. Really not a great place. The question I had is, as a writer and as a media creator, what do you think is the most powerful way that we can be reaching the non-converted audience?
You know, one of the reasons that I became kind of just so enamored of the tactics that DXA has been using is the idea of taking animals, you know, kind of randomly, and then personalizing them by naming them and showing their evolution from, you know, these horrifically abused and tortured creatures into the full potential of what they are as living beings, and getting to know their personalities and seeing their light return as they're treated the way that they're supposed to be. I know, just, you know, for me, that was one of the things that I reacted to most, right? I mean, it's sort of like the old aphorism that if 1,000 people die, it's a statistic, and if one person dies, it's a tragedy. So if you talk about millions or billions of, you know, creatures being slaughtered and extinguished each year, you kind of can abstract that and put some distance in it. But if you start really relating, I mean, just even seeing those chinchillas before, you know, just made my empathy all the stronger, because I watched the three of them, and I watched their personalities, and I watched how they interact with the world. And it just made me more emotionally moved than if you had just said to me, isn't it terrible that, you know, we're killing chinchillas by this number and turning them into fur? So I think keeping in mind how we as human beings empathize and relate, and it's just what Anita said, like tapping to that love and compassion that we're all capable of having across the political spectrum and everything else. I really think that's the key to getting people to open their minds up, oftentimes in a way that they might not want to.
And just to, very quickly, to connect a question that was asked previously to yours, my vegan mummy, the woman that converted me, wears a MAGA hat. She's really into Trump. She thinks he's amazing. In fact, when I last came here, I was in DC, she made me buy a hat for her and her boyfriend. So and I love her to bits and pieces, we disagree on a plethora, like almost everything, except animal liberation. We agree on that. So how do we get our message out? We present facts as we see them. We aggregate data and present that as we see them. We try to be compelling in a way that isn't either class-based or race-based or political party-based. But what we try to do is try to make it about the animal. And to draw on what both of my panelists have been saying here today, when you focus on like the love and all that, it's really easy to get the message out there, because everyone wants it and everyone wants to spread it around, really. So that's the easiest part of, I mean, I was the angry vegan stereotype and like shunning myself. I didn't carry a stick, that's news.
It's actually true. I used to carry a stick.
Yes, it's unusual. I didn't carry a stick.
This is 15 years ago.
But I did emotionally hold myself back until I spent more time with Kathy, and I realized that actually she's, and her boyfriend, that we share way more important things than that which divides us. So I think that's a really integral part of it. Anita?
I think when using love-based community organizing and drawing people in from like environmental justice, and in North Carolina, people of all classes are concerned about CAFOs. But I think we can use this as a foot in the door to help people that are extremely right-wing and Trump supporters to then become more social justice oriented. So we should, just like we try to get people who are concerned about health to care about animals and do what they do for the animals, let's try to use the universal love for animals to also work on social justice and anti-militarism aspects. And that's what the civil rights movement did, the three things, the social justice, anti-militarism, and anti-poverty.
Wow. All right, folks. Can we give some snaps for the panel here today? That might have been the best panel I've ever seen in my history as an animal rights activist, and I'm just so honored to have been able to ask some questions of all of you.